My name is Joanna MacGregor. I'm a pianist. I've played lots of times at the Wigmore Hall. It's great to be here in the Gerald Moore room. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Beethoven variations and about why composers want to write variations. I thought I'd start with that first. So from a composer's point of view, writing a set of variations is a great compositional practice. You take a very simple theme, often something very popular, and you squeeze out of it as much as you can, and it allows you to experiment, it allows you to try out new textures, you can juxtapose lots of emotions, you can write wild music right next door to sad music or tender music. And very interestingly as well, and Beethoven really capitalized on this, it can be commercially very successful writing variations. Beethoven was writing at a time when piano manufacture was taking off. There was a great sense of amateur music making. And although a lot of the music he wrote was very complex and very advanced, he also liked to write music that would sell well. And certainly some of the earlier variations are a really good example of this. I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the Goldberg variations, because this is a fantastically important piece in the history of variation writing. And it's almost certainly a piece that really influenced Beethoven, particularly when he wrote the Diabelli variations right towards the end of his career. So the Goldberg variations, as many of you know, are monumental, fantastically virtuosic and exciting creative variations. But the important thing is this: it comes from a very simple theme. And in fact, the important thing to know is it's not a theme at all, it's a set of chords. And this is the trick about variations. What you're looking for are harmonies that you can develop and exploit effectively. So of course, the aria sounds very beautiful, and the opening of it is like this. So of course at this point all of you are listening to the beautiful melody, the sort of floating transcendental melody at the top, but in fact what Bach is going to use is a set of harmonies, and in particular a ground bass. It really couldn't be simpler. And of course the idea of the walking bass is a very Baroque trope, but it is something that Beethoven returns to in his variations. And of course the Goldberg variations is highly dramatic. It immediately sets out a pattern. It's full of fuguettas and counterpoint. It juxtaposes popular music with profoundly spiritual music, and this is something that Beethoven is going to do very much, perhaps in a slightly rougher way, and also he's very witty, Beethoven, often in his variations. But this big piece is what's going to define, I think, Beethoven variations. So the earlier Beethoven variations are simpler. They're very funny, often, and he loves picking very popular themes. He picks things like God Save the King, a theme from Handel's Judas Maccabeus. He writes a very nice set of variations on a magic flute aria for cello and piano. He's deliberately picking things that we would all know, a bit like pop tunes of today, and writing some quick variations on them. I've wanted to show you a little bit of his Rule Britannia variations, which are really fun. They're tiny. They only last about 4 or 5 minutes. He wrote them in 1803. They're very jaunty, very witty. He was rather keen on English tunes. And of course, this is the tune that everybody sings on the last night of the proms. And he sets it very, very simply. There's nothing sort of difficult about this. It's really silly and sort of childlike and a lot of fun, actually, and the chorus as well. I mean, we can all sing along to that. But then straight away, this is typical Beethoven, he actually forgets about the theme and does something rather sea-like with a rather mysterious bass line. So straight away he's trying to evoke the sea. There's something a bit serious and sinister about it. And actually you can sing the tune to this, but he's lost the tune. Obviously he's not interested in it anymore. And he does the obligatory minor variation. Obviously if you're going to pick D major, you're always going to do minor keys. Bach obviously completely changed the emotion and the temperature of the Goldberg variations once he started writing in G minor rather than G major. This one is still quite funny. He still uses the rolling C bass. So he's being, I think, sort of rather light and witty, with a sort of national theme. And the other thing he does, which is very typical Beethoven, he has a little coda at the end of his variations, and he just keeps on repeating this idea, but in lots of different keys. That kind of thing, and also with lots of sforzandos. Which is a very, very Beethoven idea, the idea of the sforzando on the offbeat. So clearly this is designed for amateur players or young ladies who like to play the keyboard. It's frothy and it's light, but it's got all the Beethoven hallmarks that you would expect and you certainly see in the sonatas. I'd like to turn to the 32 variations in C minor. These are some of my favourite variations, actually. I think it's a fantastic work because partly it always tells me what Beethoven might have been like as a player. They're very volatile, explosive, and rather technical in a really educational way. It's as if he's trying to write a series of variations which make you practice, which again would have been quite good for amateur players. They're really hard, but they're just about manageable. You want to practice to be able to play them. They're based on a very Baroque idea. Again, this idea of the ground bass that falls away like Bach's Goldberg variations. So typical of Beethoven because it's really Baroque. It's a sort of French overture, double dotting, and of course has this whacking great sforzando, and these are all the elements he's going to keep in the variations. He then goes on to do a whole series of very fast 8-bar variations designed to get you through a whole series of technical problems almost, and he hangs on to the idea of the bass line because this is key in the theme and variations. So this is an early one. It's all about this. This is what you've got to listen out for all the time. He also makes you, I don't know, work quite hard. Let's have a look. Oh yeah, here we are. This idea that you're going to have to rush around and practice your arpeggios and jump up and down. One here for octaves. Fantastic and very kind of vigorous sort of music. The other thing that's great in these variations is that they are quite modern, and there's a couple of variations where you feel like he's invented minimalism. I want to give you an example of this. He gets there before Philip Glass does. Here we are. Again, listen to the bass line because it's all hanging on this Baroque bass line. The idea that you play something very slow and mysterious and then immediately change the weather in a variation. But I really love this one because of these strange crunching chords and this sort of Einstein on the beach feel that it has. The other thing this set of variations does is that it has rather an extended coda. which Beethoven was quite fond of. So it's as if he did his variations and then he wants to give you something extra at the end. So the last couple of variations in this one sound like a river bursting its banks. To remember, of course, on Beethoven's piano, these bass lines wouldn't have sounded quite as muddy as they do on a modern piano. I mean, one of the problems for pianists, I think, playing Beethoven on a modern piano is these bass textures are often quite thick and quite heavy, and they are really exciting. I mean, they are what makes it sound like Beethoven, but on the other hand, it would have been thinner on Beethoven's own piano. So this is an example of how you've got to use your ears and pedal and try not to allow it to become too dark and overcome this right hand. And then, of course, he still has a couple more pages to go. It's, you know, rather sweetly with Beethoven, sometimes he doesn't want to end a piece. You think it's ended, and yet it hasn't ended yet. You know, it's absolutely wonderful, this piece. It's also very witty because it's very loud, and at the end, and then he just does this tiny cadence as if that's it, goodbye. You know, it's lovely. After all these fantastic variations that he writes, it's such a great piece. I also want to mention to you the Eroica variations, which he wrote in 1802. Eroica, of course, you'll immediately think of the symphony, but the theme he used 4 times. He used in 4 different pieces, and this is one of them. These very difficult 15 variations with a fugue. And what I love about this opening is that he uses silence, which is another great attribute of Beethoven. He is one of the great composers before John Cage to really exploit the use of silence in music. So first of all, these set of variations just start with a bass line. When you're not playing anything, when you're having to do silence, that's the most frightening bit for a performance. They always want to be playing notes rather than counting. But that is just fantastic. And then he sets up 4 ways of playing with that bass line before the theme itself arrives. Which you'll know very well from the symphony. And then, of course, he starts the variations properly. Again, these are actually very difficult. They're very awkward to play, these variations. I think most of us agree that these are slightly unpianistic in the way Beethoven can be. Sometimes it doesn't lie up very well under the fingers. He uses a lot of counterpoint in these, and they're very discursive. Also, they are marvellously kind of mixed. I mean, he tends to mix his emotions in this quite a bit. So you have something that sounds rather ladylike halfway through. Followed quite soon by something much more burlesque. Sort of rather like street music. And then he immediately follows it with something very Bach-like and spiritual in the minor key. Straight away you're in a much more serious, more transcendental kind of area. And I think this is a great example of the way Beethoven moves between the popular and the religious and the transcendental and the lightweight very easily. I mean, he's someone who can move through this and probably must have appeared terribly innovative and rather modern at the time. Even now, it's quite a shock sometimes how he'll change temperature. And of course, famously, these variations finish with a fugue, or he puts a big fugue in towards the end, as he does with the Diabelli variations. And I think people feel that Beethoven invented this style of putting in a really big fugue towards the end of a set of variations. He doesn't quite end them with the fugue. This is something that went on to influence Brahms, because of course you'll think of Brahms and the Handel variations, which really does end with a massive fugue, really huge, very exciting fugue. So obviously it's as if he wants to expand the form so much that he needs to have something even bigger than a set of variations. So of course you'll know about the Diabelli variations, which seems to be Beethoven's reply to the Goldberg variations. It's even bigger. It's like a human comedy. I mean, and everything that implies, you know, it seems to take on the whole of life. It's intensely comic and funny, and it's also tragic. It really does tell you about the human condition, this piece. And famously, it's all based on a ridiculous theme that Diabelli sent out to a group of composers. And famously, Beethoven was very rude about this theme, and seemed to then deliver, you know, the 33 variations as a riposte to what a rubbish theme this was. However, with the benefit of hindsight, this seems to me to be the most perfect theme for Beethoven ever to work on, because it has everything in it that he's so good at handling. It's slightly ridiculous, it's full of sudden dynamic changes. It's got an interesting harmonic structure. So really now, looking back, you can look at it and just go, yeah, well, of course, this was a perfect theme for Beethoven. This is a perfect theme for him, because you can hear all the elements. So you've got this idea of the chord doing this with the crescendo. It's great. The lovely grace notes. This idea of the grace note that's off the beat, and also the actual sforzandos that are so good. It's just great. So it's all set up. It's set up for something marvellous to happen. And of course he just breaks all the rules constantly in the Diabelli variations. He doesn't even stick to the time signature in the first one. The first variation is a sort of march. You know, he just does away with the waltz altogether. And it is highly complex. It's absolutely a million miles away from these early variations where young ladies might sit at a keyboard perhaps and play Rule Britannia, you know, or enjoy the sort of exercises that some of the variations offer. This is really like walking into a contemporary art gallery and being completely dazzled by very, very modern things that you're looking at. Here's an example of, I mentioned how he's very good with silence in the Eroica variations. This is one where almost nothing happens. This idea where you sort of go, is this a theme? What's he doing? And it's all about rests more than anything else. I also mentioned the fact of texture, how texture is very difficult often in Beethoven, and he follows it immediately with these amazingly thick chords in the left hand. Very reminiscent of his amazing variations that finish Opus 111, his final sonata. There's two other things I want to mention about the Diabelli, because they remind us again of the Goldberg variations. This wonderful aria that he puts in towards the end. Me very much of the 25th variation in the Goldbergs. That sort of very tragic world. The other thing that strikes me about this aria is how he's turned the waltz into a slow motion waltz. If you look at the left hand, it's a waltz absolutely slowed right down, this idea. Really fantastic. And then, of course, he follows it with his mighty fugue. So this is Diabelli Variations. I mean, it's a huge world. You could spend your entire life studying this piece, of course. So, of course, Beethoven didn't just write variations, standalone variations. He used the variation form in his piano sonatas, and they were very important variation forms to him. Always on his own original themes, because some of the variations I've talked to you about are on other people's themes, you know, either very popular things or things he's been given, like the Diabelli Waltz. So he wrote beautiful themes to do his variations on in the sonatas. I just want to mention a few. There's the beginning of Opus 26, which is very Schubertian idea. Really beautiful, elegant set of variations. He also writes a fantastic set of variations in the middle of the Appassionata Sonata, which are very hymn-like and spiritual. And then most famously, in his late sonatas, Opus 109 variations, which can be quite Bach-like again, and then his transcendental farewell to the piano sonata in Opus 111, which ends with a huge set of variations. So clearly the variation form for Beethoven gives him a great sense of amplitude. He can express himself very well and often literally open the piano up by writing there's often a sense of the piano world and the piano sound being oceanic suddenly. So he receives this lineage from the Goldberg variations from Bach. He does this incredible sense of what you can do with variations, and then he hands it on to Brahms and Schumann, who then write their own wonderful sets of variations. And from there you get Schoenberg-Webern, the Berg Chamber Concerto, which is an incredible set of variations. And even more modern, Frederick Rzeszewski's The People United Will Never Be Defeated, which is his reply to the Diabellis. So you can see how this great history of variation writing is endless.